All right, good morning. This is the recorded version of this talk that I'm giving today in person um, at the Poor Handmaids of Jesus Christ Ministry Center. But I know there's people that maybe can't make it, and so I thought I'd make a recording anyway. It's a little bit of created for an internal audience, so if anybody's reading this from the outside, there'll be some internal references. Sorry about that, but I thought you might still find portions of it interesting. So this is a part of our programming on the season of creation. And the season of creation is an annual Christian celebration of prayer and action for our common home. Together, the ecumenical family around the world unites to pray, protect, and advocate for God's creation. The season starts the 1st of September, which is the World Day for Prayer for the care of creation, and ends the October 4th, which is the feast of St. Francis of Assisi, the patron saint of ecology and beloved by many Christian denominations. So we've had some contemplative experiences here. We've had some prayer experiences as a part of our celebrations internally, and I'm kind of coming with a little bit more of a science perspective to round everything out. And here are some of the habitat and research projects that have started at the Poor Handmaids of Jesus Christ Mother House here in Donaldson, Indiana. A variety of ones, some set up for kind of more public education, some for research. But today we're just going to be highlighting the pollinator plantings that I started in 2017, the first spring after I was hired. So for the objectives for these were to increase the biodiversity on site, starting with the plant biodiversity, which would then yield to the rest of insects and mammals and everything else and birds. Decrease the mowing needs. So most of these sites I'm taking out of mowing areas that we're mowing but didn't really need to. Beautification, and to research prairie establishment methods. So I'm using some of these terms loosely. I'm not going to get too tied up on any of them, but pollinator plantings, prairie establishment, prairie plantings, flower gardens. I'm trying to lean away from the gardening sense in that it's a step towards the wild away from individual gardening. But when I say prairie, I basically mean a non-woody ecosystem. So fewer shrubs and trees, and these mostly focus on herbaceous perennial plants. So non-woody plants that come back year after year, and you don't need to reseed. Like this beautiful plant on the right, Queen of the Prairie, Philopendra rubra. And this fritillary butterfly that I probably should have got to the species level ID, but it's a beautiful fritillary butterfly on butterfly weed, which is a milkweed plant. So the steps to do these, the first one is to prepare the site. That usually means if you're dealing with a sod of grass, we're talking about cool season grasses that you're familiar with on your lawn. So they will get pretty dried up in the summer, but spring and fall, they have a nice carpet of green. We all like lawns for various reasons. But you need to generally kill those grasses first before you plant. And usually we try to do that with herbicide because tilling up the soil kind of disrupts the soil structure. It brings more weed seeds to the surface. So if you can just do a single herbicide application, kill the lawn, and then seed directly on top of it and let the winter freeze and thaw, work it into the soil, that usually works out best. The first year or two, you're going to want to mow down the annual weeds, mow it high so that the perennials can slowly grow because it takes them several years. And then afterwards, as soon as you can, you're going to want to burn it frequently. That will help keep the woody species out and also help the perennials established. And then you need to wait a few years to a century and keep planting and burning, and maintenance will go on forever. So this is an aerial of the campus. You're looking at about 150 acres or so. Lake Galbraith right there is a 30-acre kettle lake, and the stars are places that we put in these pollinator plantings. So we needed to collect seed and purchase seed. So I generally, based on my budget, I would go out and do a purchase of commercial seed from native seed providers. go out and look at a variety of quotes and what seeds they had available, purchase those, and then supplement with the existing seeds that we could harvest on site. Sometimes and that way we could boost the biodiversity of our mix without increasing the cost. So I looked at what we had on site already, I collected those, and then I purchased seeds that we did not have. This was a part of our seed gathering efforts. So not only did we have to gather the seed, but we had to kind of process it in order to get the husks and all the extraneous parts of the plant away. This is with Maria Center residents, which is our senior living facility here in 2017, doing just that with the seeds, getting prepared. So thank you to everyone pictured there and those that weren't pictured. And then you end up with stuff like this. These are seeds from common milkweed, which a lot of people are familiar with, and definitely thankful for all the labor it takes to separate those from the very feathery pappus that makes the seeds fly. You also want to put up signs so that people know what you're doing. It definitely looks messy for a couple years, and some people think it looks messy in the end as well, but it definitely is a process. People are not used to it. People are not used to establishing perennials from seed generally. Usually you buy plants in pots and such. So putting up educational signs is a good idea. And here is Kurt helping us out, trying to remove a bit of the thatch from the site. We did have it sprayed down, but I was concerned with how much thatch was on the ground, and you really need, like any farmer knows, you need good seed to soil contact. So we need the seeds hitting the ground. And I will say on this project, well, I'll get to that in a second. So here's a good candidate. This is a retention pond that is receiving runoff from one of our parking lots. And just past this little berm is Lake Galbraith. And so this place would be inundated, but then it would dry out and we would mow it because it would look kind of rangy if you didn't mow it. But there's no reason to mow it. Nobody picnics there. It's not in anybody's front yard. It's really unnecessary, and you're missing out on some habitat benefits. You can still keep that berm in the back so you can walk around. So this is spring of 2017, right before we planted it. And here's September of that year. You know, we stopped mowing, and usually what you see is a bunch of annual weeds. Mostly what you see there is foxtail, and it's hard to be patient. The first year, it always feels and looks like a disaster. You see almost all annual weeds, and you're thinking, why did I just waste all that money on seed? There's nothing growing here. I'm a failure. But over time, with patience, persistence, as one of my mentors said, patience is a prairie word. You see things start to fill in. So already on the right-hand side of this photo, we have the beautiful purple of the bee balm, also known as Monarda. That is in July of the second growing season. So already, these are pictures from that same day that I took that picture. We have bee balm, we have swamp milkweed, which is another host for the monarch butterfly. And so those are already supporting a huge number of insects and then also birds, which will feed on the insects or the seeds. So very quickly, these can be very, very beneficial to the environment, even though these will continue to change quite a bit over the first 3-4 years and then continue to change after that. One thing I did want to note somewhere in here is that the reason we are doing this and bringing in so many species is that a large portion of insects, the insect world, are specialists on maybe one species or one genus, a group of species. They have certain adaptations, either physical or biochemical, to feed on that plant, either the leaf tissues or the flowers, the nectar, the pollen. And so every species you bring in, you potentially bring in, let's say, 10 different insect species, or let's call it 20. So each new species you can bring, you've just increased 20-fold the number of insects for each species. So instead of having just a flat area of one species and 20 insects, if you have 10 species, now you have 200 insects. So you have that basically security and diversity, just like anybody who's giving you good investment advice generally is making sure that you are fully diversified across stocks and bonds and different sectors of the economy and different durations of bonds, short-term, medium, and long-term. Same thing with nature and biodiversity. is that we want a great diversity of plants so that if one has a really bad year and collapses, there are several others to take its place and fill that niche. So now we're looking at growing season 4 of the same area. You see that sign on the left, and you see cup plant start to growing over top of everything, maybe 6-7 feet tall. And again, that bee balm is back. And we're continuing to burn this site off because you see woody growth already starting to encroach in that area, and we want to keep that nice and open. So we're burning it off to get rid of the thatch, to get rid of the weeds, and let those perennials get a nice early start in the spring, April and May. So here just recently is a photo from growing season number 5 in August, and the place is absolutely loaded with flowers, loaded with pollinators on this tiny little triangle that nobody was really using and we were just mowing. So now we have saved time, short amount of time, but adds up every week for mowing staff that they can have their skills deployed elsewhere, and having a great boost of butterflies there. And it also increases just the aesthetics and the ambiance that we're trying to create for our guests as well. So here's another pollinator planting. Let's go back in time to 2017. You can see up on the hill, that is the Moon Tree Lodge, 2017. And I will say with all of these, it has been very forgiving and very surprising how these plantings have been, even though I didn't do all the timing quite right. I seeded a lot of these because I wasn't able to properly kill the grass turf the previous summer in time before I made these plans. I didn't want to wait an entire extra year because I'm impatient, didn't know how long I was going to be here. So I decided to wait until the spring, till the grass greened up in April, kill it with the herbicide, and then plant it in May, which is way, 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 way late if you're planting these seeds in May. Ideally, you can put them down in the winter and give the snow and ice and everything time to work into the soil. So they established fairly slowly. They maybe would have been, we probably would have been at the same spot today had I just waited a year, because the establishment would have been better, but whatever. So here's roughly the same vantage point in growing season number 5 in July of this year. And it's hard to see at this scale, but we have dozens and dozens of native perennial wildflowers, and that's what we want to see. Here's another spot over by the nursing home. You can see the X shape on the top of the nursing home, the structure there. And in the center of the screen is the no-mow area. So by 2005 at least, this area was not mowed. Again, for probably those same reasons, to save fuel, to save labor, and to just kind of give the land a little break and let stuff grow there. So that's been there for about 16 years. So in an adjacent area to the no-mow area, just right next to it, I basically did a pollinator planting. Here I am planting in May, months too late, but it was very, like I said, it's very forgiving. Keep throwing more seed down, keep burning it, and it works. Here is October of that first year. The sod, I did get killed, but then you get this flush of annual weeds and you get crabgrass. So almost everything you see there is crabgrass. And so I'm like, okay, great. Nothing's coming up. It's a failure. This is going to take forever. But you keep burning it. You keep throwing seed down. This site in particular, because it did not look very well, I kept throwing seed down over top of it at the beginning. There's again with the signage. And we burned it the last 3 springs. And on the left, you see the traditional no-mow area. On the right, you see the planted area with that line down the middle. Here's from another vantage point from the perspective of the statue of the Blessed Mother. You have on the left is the planting, and to the right of that red line is the old no-mow area. So on the left, that's a 5-year-old planting. On the right is a 16-year-old no-mow area. And so I wanted to quantify the differences there, to see how much of a difference it made that we actually planted it rather than just left it alone. Because the idea of some people have, or we've thought about is like, okay, if we just leave an area alone, let nature take its course, it's gonna just come back to life and reseed with all these species, and come back to life. So we're kind of testing that hypothesis with this. We have a side-by-side comparison of what happens if you just leave nature alone and versus if you plant it. And I definitely don't want to extrapolate this to every ecological context. That's not the point. But take this for what it is. So switching vantage points again, this is looking south. On the left is the Nomo area. On the right is the pollinator garden prairie planting. You see on the right a little more texture, right? You can see some white flowers in there, maybe a little yellow, but you see a lot more texture, even from this ground photo, even not knowing many of the plants. There's just more structure to the planting there. Here's a close-up on the left. I see mostly just sod grasses. Even after 16 years, those grasses have formed such a complete sod over the soil that nothing is really getting through there and germinating. The smattering of plants that you see there are common milkweed, which can grow just about anywhere that you stop mowing. You don't really need to plant it because the seeds travel so far, but really there's almost no diversity there. And if you look to your right, again, you see different shades of the grasses. Those are different species of grass. You see different structural components to it. And so let's look at the data when we look into that. So just recently in August, I looked at the planted area versus the Nomo area. So again, the Nomo has been there for at least 16 years. The planted area is now entering its 5th growing season. And the number of total species in the planted area far outweighs is about 4 to 5 times as much as the Nomo area. And not just the total species, but the native species, the species that mostly that I was planting there, that we were planting there. We had almost 50 native species in that small little patch. And in the Nomo area, you only had just a handful. You had a couple trees that were starting to try to grow there. You had common milkweed, maybe some yarrow, and that really was about it. So even though that's still a good idea to do a Nomo area because you are saving on fuel, you're saving on emissions, you're redeploying your time to other purposes, it really is not a recipe for what we'd call ecological restoration. These are the seeded species that I found in August 2021 in this recent survey. These were ones that were in the seed mix and were by growing season number 5 were evident, and there was undoubtedly several more in there that I could not see because I did not look over every square meter of this planting. I just did kind of a back and forth wandering. And so some of the species, just a nice diversity, different colors, different bloom periods, some blooms early in the spring, some in the summer, some in the late summer to fall. We have hairy petunia there. In the middle is a purple coneflower, and on the right is a false daisy. Just some really amazing things. And of course, doing this so that it continues up the food chain. So again, we have take all those differences times 10 when it comes to the insect life that we have there. And you can see that this can quickly become an island, a refuge of the surrounding landscape that is often missing these species, this prescribed fire and this intentional care. We have swallowtail butterflies, we have all kinds of moths that I can't identify without the help of a computer, and the ubiquitous green tree frog that we see everywhere that loves these plantings as well. This isn't on this site, but these were just beautiful as well. These are also species that we either seeded or moved in. On the left is prickly pear cactus, which is a native species found in the sandy spots in our region. And on the right is purple prairie clover. So again, getting back to this idea that we kind of have of, we'll just let nature take its course, and the seeds will come, the species will come from around. They'll come from around. Well, there's not a lot of around left. This is the next gravel road over from the property, Tulip Road. There's this really narrow strip alongside the road that contains a little bit of diversity of prairie species. But other than that, starting in the mid-19th century, 75% of the county or more was deforested, drained, and plowed, and those parcels have not been restored. So you have maybe that tiny little strip in the ditches and everything, but without a very intentional effort to collect, to sort, segregate, to plan, to examine the soil and the water table. What would happen absent all these interventions is probably a weedy mess that would take centuries to resolve. Um, it's already difficult enough to restore prairie. It's going to take decades for us to restore anything like the original prairie function. But if you just let these fields go up in weeds and then turn over to perennials, you're going to get a mess of, let me see if I got the species coming up here. Well, sorry, it's not letting me go back while I'm recording for some reason. Maybe what the picture that you saw in about 1 second was Sister Mary. Let's see if I can pause and go back here. Okay, it's not letting me. Sister Mary collecting seeds with some students, which I was just trying to demonstrate the importance of knowing what the species are that should be here and understanding them, knowing when to harvest them, what their growth characteristics are, when you need to intervene, is all, it's a specific knowledge set that professionals need to cultivate, but also lay people in their own way also need to be responsible for cultivating. And here in this picture I was so happy to come across this when I was out doing field work. On the left, you see what's probably a black oak or a red oak seedling, which is a very important component of our native ecosystems, our savannas and open oak woodlands in the area. On the right is a bush honeysuckle, which is an imported species from Asia that doesn't have any natural checks and balances on it in our region and will basically over the decades destroy a forest. It forms a impenetrable shrub layer under the overstory canopy and prevents regeneration of trees, as well as any diversity of grass or wildflowers on the forest floor. So over time, bush honeysuckle, if you do not manage it, will destroy or basically destroy the ecosystem. It's a very, very serious threat. And so what you can see on the right is the blue dye that we use for when we apply herbicides. We try to do it in a very targeted manner, in a safe manner, because to try to do this manually alone, you would need about 10 times as much labor to do this without chemical herbicides in this case. So we use something that adheres to these leaves, is not persistent in the soil, will kill that one shrub and then be done. And then this will allow the oak on the left to grow and eventually, hopefully, attain the size of a full-grown tree. Absent this intervention, it would have been highly likely in this particular case that the bush honeysuckle would have grown much faster, would have overtopped and shaded out that oak. So the idea that we just have hands off, let nature take its course is it maybe made one sense in our mind, or it's a concept that we could still kind of hold in tension with these other components. But really what this entire thing that I'm trying to express with the seasons of creation is that humans do have a role with creation. We have a role in the cosmos. The ecosystems that we inhabit in northern Indiana have been inhabited by humans for 10,000 years. There were humans here chopping trees down, harvesting plants, setting fires all over the place, harvesting animals, and doing so in such a way that led to not a diminution of the biodiversity, but an explosion of the biodiversity. It was a highly biodiverse region in this part of the country. And it was biodiverse with a good amount of humans living here. Obviously, there's different contexts, so we have to be wise in our interpretation of our current situation. We have cities, we have a much higher population, the global atmosphere has changed, nitrogen and phosphorus deposition has changed, the hydrology of the land has changed. So we still have to take these modern things into consideration. But the idea that if you just removed humans, everything would come roaring back is just not accurate. And I think the hopeful story there is that this is where we belong. We do have a role to play in caretaking for these species that we live with and ultimately do depend on, even though we are still largely ignorant of all these processes. Speaking of our ignorance, and wrapping up here, this plant is called a cup plant, Silphium perfoliatum. The leaves grow basically around the stem, forming what looks like a series of cups up the stem. There's the Latin for perfoliatum, it's like a perforation through the leaves, the stem's coming up. And this is a native species in our region, usually found in wet areas that we reintroduced in certain areas. And so these cup plants have several species of aphids that feed on them, other species of, I think they're beetles maybe, or weevils, that will basically decapitate the seed heads, and you can have them come through an area and have zero seed production over a year because this bloom of this infestation of this beetle or weevil. And this is this back and forth that we see in nature of a species flourishing and gaining a foothold and then being kept in check by pathogens and parasites and insects and herbivores. It's this back and forth that allows this huge diversity of plants and animals to coexist with each other. So we have quite a bit of this on the property in different places. This is cup plant at the area that I showed you. And even since I started working here just recently, only 5 years ago, we're still discovering species that are dependent on these plants. Researchers at Purdue and a university in South Dakota found 7 new wasp species that are parasitic on the aphids that feed on the plants. So it's not just the aphids that are feeding unchecked on these plants. There are parasites on the aphids. So those keep the aphids in check, which keeps the cup plant. And those are constantly ebbing and flowing across the landscape and across time. And it's not discussed here, but there's also parasitic wasps on the parasitic wasps on the aphids on the cup plant. So we should have a little bit of humility and trepidation when we are either destroying biodiversity or failing to act, a sin, what I would call probably a sin of omission, failing to restore biodiversity because we're destroying things that are intricate and beautiful and that we don't even fully understand. So hoping that actually is a inspiration to you that you do have a role to play, no matter what your position or status in life, or who you live with, or where you live. There are concrete things that you can do to interact with natural environments and to benefit from them. And so this is where, in our normal presentation, I'll be doing a Q&A, and it looks like this was about 28 minutes, so that seems like a good talk time. Maybe I'll go a little quicker. So since we don't have this isn't a live presentation, you can just leave comments below and I will try to keep an eye out and respond to those. And if I made any errors or you want some clarification on some of those things that I mentioned, just let me know. All right, thanks for watching.